Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ananda Miles, and I'm the Senior Manager of Communications here at the Aerospace Industries Association. Thank you all for joining us for our latest Aero Insight. Today, we have Tim White, our Vice President of Engineering and Technology, to discuss the current state of AI legislation. At the end of this discussion, we will have a brief Q&A, so please feel free to type any questions you may have at any point during this webinar. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Tim White.
Ananda, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As we begin, a couple of items that I wanted to recognize is first, I recognize Preston Lynn, who helped develop this content, as well as our excellent comms team. Thank you both for your assistance in making sure that we get the right content in the right format at the right time. So let's go to the next slide there, which is our agenda slide. So a couple of topics that we're going to be addressing here. We'll look at the original executive order on AI. We'll look at the OMB guidance that is really looking at how is that EO implemented. And then we'll take a deeper dive into the Senate AI roadmap. We'll also look at other legislation that may be on tap or being considered right now. And then we'll end with Q&A. Just so you're aware, at the very end of the presentation, I've got a slide that has links to the various different pieces of legislation or content that you would be able to go back and reference after the fact. So no need to go searching for it. We'll provide that at the very end. So next slide. So to set the stage here, let's recognize where we are in the overall ecosystem of legislation and regulation on AI. There is a lot going on. In the 118th Congress, I think that there's now been about 80 pieces of legislation related to AI that have been introduced. Some are moving forward, some are not. But even so, that's a tremendous amount of legislation that's out there. And that's just in Congress. In addition to what's going on in Congress, you also have state level regulation that's going on, and even municipality level regulation that's going on. New York City just released a new requirement for how AI can be used if you're doing hiring and selection of hirees in bringing on people into a company. Also, at a very big picture view, the EU literally this week just made law their new AI Act, and the United Nations as well has some activity where they are proposing to create rules. And so what you're seeing is that there's very much high interest in making sure that we are effectively utilizing and not negatively impacting users of AI or those who may not be users but are impacted by it. So a lot going on there. So as we begin, we're going to focus in on what's going on in the United States. And the first really significant part there is the EO on AI. It was released October 30th of last year and entitled Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Development and Use of Artificial Intelligence. It takes an interesting format in that it's got several sections, and within each one of the sections, which are really arranged as topics, it says for each one of the agencies impacted, here's what you need to do. And in many cases, they're very similar across many agencies pursuing the same activity. A couple of things that I'm drawing out here, and keep in mind, there is so much going on, not just in the EO, but obviously, as I talked about in the broader sense of legislation and regulation, there's no way that we could possibly go through all of that in even several hours. There's just a lot going on. And so what I've tried to do is pull out topics that are of interest or applicability to the aerospace industry. Obviously, that's our perspective here at AIA. So one of the things to be aware of is that there's a lot of talk about how do you regulate these large models? And you might think about the large language models that you've heard quite a bit about, such as Llama or ChatGPT, there are XAI. These are very, very large models. They consume a tremendous amount of data to do their training. And then the models themselves that consume that data have many different parameters, essentially different neurons that they're looking at the data and trying to discern patterns in that data that it's consuming. The EO goes in and says for these very large models that there needs to be some control. And it does that in two ways. Number one, it says at very least you need to be reporting on what testing that you're doing on those models themselves. What verification and validation are you using? And it talks a lot about red teaming, which is adversarial use of any computing system. It also goes in and says you need to do additional reporting, and it has NIST that is setting up the requirements for assessment of those models. So the reporting that you would do will be driven by NIST, and it directs NIST to go and create those requirements, which is ongoing and in process. It also gives the option to change what the definition of large model will be. And it does so, I think that that's actually really prescient because it acknowledges the fact that models are both getting larger as well as smaller. And so the computing industry recognizes that one of the great challenges is that if you consume all of the data in the world, it's tremendously costly, has implications for the amount of money that it takes to train, but it also has environmental impacts. And they've said, you know, are there better models out there that don't require so much compute that would still get you the same result? And so the EO recognizes that what is state of the art today is highly unlikely to be state of the art tomorrow, and they give specific direction on how those standards will be changed. Couple of call outs here from the EO. One is from the DoD. It looks internally, and then it also looks at it and says, are there things that we need to do from the government perspective to make sure that we're effectively utilizing this, and then give us some recommendations on talent. So from the software perspective and then from the human perspective. Department of State might be a little bit orthogonal to the aerospace industry, but what it did call out there that I thought was interesting is the use of the AI risk management framework. And that's a very good document if you're interested in understanding, how do I characterize, how do I understand, how do I estimate, how do I deal with the risks associated with AI implementation. So if you haven't seen that, I would strongly recommend go take a look at that. It's actually very well thought out and gives you some pretty good direction. Finally, for the SBA, there is a recognition that some of these models and a lot of the AI that's being deployed today is really in the domain of very large businesses. They have overhead rates that can support it, but small businesses can be highly benefited by it. And it directs the SBA to consider whether costs associated and really advocates for costs that are associated with implementation of AI if they can be expensed. So a couple of different things to consider there. Let's go to the next slide, which talks about the OMB guidance. So the EO directs the OMB to really manage the deployment of the EO, and they've been doing so and really making good progress there. On March 28th, they issued additional guidance, and then they also talked about the progress that has been made. So it within the EO, it says that the agencies must hire chief AI officers, CAIOs, and within the OMB guidance, it gives additional direction on who these people should be, what are their tasks. It also talks about the need to conduct AI assessments and to do training in real world scenarios, which essentially implies red teaming. One of the interesting things that it requires agencies to do is to publish a list on an ongoing basis of AI use cases. So they're requiring those agencies to disclose, where are you using AI? I think that the compilation of those use case documents will be very interesting to be able to see where is the federal government writ large utilizing or perhaps not utilizing some of the AI capabilities. And then it also notes that the CAIOs have a specific accountability for identifying and then managing any AI that can be considered safety impacting or rights impacting. And I would call your attention to Appendix 1 of the OMB guidance, because they actually do a really good job in that appendix of identifying, giving examples of what does it mean, what would be an example of safety impacting AI or rights impacting AI. Let's go on to the next slide, which talks about the Senate AI roadmap. So this is the most recent, I would argue it's not legislation, it is a roadmap, but it comes from a bipartisan group of senators, a gang of four, and you've got Senate Majority Leader Schumer, Senator Rounds, Senator Young, and Senator Heinrich. And they came together and held 9 bipartisan AI Insight forums. And Eric Fanning, CEO of AIA, participated in 2. As I said, there are links at the back of the presentation. You may want to go and take a look at the link to these to the roadmap, and the reason is because they go through each one of the 9 hearings, the 9 forums, if you will. They identify who participated, and then there's a quick summary. And you can click on each one of the people who participated in each one of the forums and see their statements. So if you'd like to get a good sense for what was talked about, you can actually read it right there. It's really, I think, well organized. The other thing that I would highlight is that the document itself is only really 16 pages by the time you eliminate the front matter, which is a good summary, and then the end matter, which is all about the forums themselves. 16 pages, and I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this area and in this topic, go read those 16 pages, because they'll give you a really good kind of blush at what is important, what is bipartisan, and what the art of the possible really will be with respect to legislation on AI. So very highly recommend taking a look at that. You can see the 8 sections down below at this slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things that it does, you can see that the first section was all about innovation, and really the approach that they took there was to advocate for certain spendings to happen there. With respect to non-defense spending, there was a blue ribbon panel that advocated that there be $32 billion in incremental spending on non-defense related AI investment. And they go through in the roadmap and say, these are the things that we think should be part of that spending. Now, I'm not going to read all of these items, but what I would encourage you on this slide and the next slide, which is the national security spending recommendations, is to consider whether there are items on this list that resonate with you that would also resonate with other people in the aerospace industry. And if so, then that's a great opportunity for you to be engaged with AIA and for AIA to be the voice of the community, where we would be able to go in to legislators and say, you have said that you intend or would like to have a certain amount of spending associated with this topic. Here's how we recommend that that goes. So again, take a look at the list and then come back to us and say, listen, here's where we think real implementation could be, or think about it in this way. Here's what we support. Here's where we have a difference of opinion. Go ahead. There you go. So national security, again, a couple of things that I would bring forward here. First of all, that middle bullet that talks about creation of pathways for data derived from sensors and other sources to be stored, transported, and used across programs. That would be a big deal. If you're familiar with much of what that goes on in national security, data can be fairly siloed, and they're recognizing that it could be a strategic enabler to have that data be unsiloed, and to the extent possible, that would be a really positive thing. You know, AI has as its lifeblood data. You need data to be able to train your models, and so having a broad view of multiple data sources is just to our advantage. The other thing that I would pull out there is you can see AUKUS referenced there, and us working collaboratively with our allies. And I think that that's a really great thing to have included in this roadmap. And the reason for that is that it recognizes that the US cannot go this alone, and we will not be successful if we go it alone. There's tremendous capabilities that are happening inside our allies' countries, and we need to be able to share with them and have them share with us, have unified strategies, unified approaches, unified data sources in order to be stronger. So this is, I think, the beginning of that and a recognition of that. Next slide, please. So in addition to discussing spending, it also gives a couple of notes and recommendations for national defense. The first thing that I would pull out is that very first sentence there, and it talks about transparency regarding its policy, speaking about the DoD, transparency regarding its policy on fully autonomous lethal weapons systems. What this recognizes is that the defense market, and in fact, the aerospace market writ large, has been utilizing AI for a long time. It is true that large language models and generative AI is a fairly new thing. I know that there are a lot of people who will say, no, we've been using generative AI for a long time, but really its explosion into the consumer awareness happened in November of 22, or 22. And having said that, though, AI as a topic has been utilized pretty heavily inside aerospace for a long time. And there are policies, and have been policies, that have been in place for extended years. And this recognizes that, yes, there are policies there. It does appropriately recognize that maybe there are ways that we need to update that policy, extend the policy. That's possible. But I think it's a very strong point to make. And by the way, the one thing that I would pull out there is that we made that point. Eric made that point as he talked about the aerospace industry's perspective in the two forums that he participated in. So it was really heartening to see that come through in the roadmap. Let's see. It also notes about the CHIPS Act, which I think is of high concern to a lot of the participants in the DoD. We recognize that you know, it's not just a software, and it's not just a model play that we're doing with AI. It also is very highly dependent on the chips, the hardware that actually runs it. So on to the next slide. Other considerations. So just a couple of things that get pulled out here that I would highlight for you. Number one, comprehensive federal privacy standards is one of the topics that has been debated quite a bit, actually, within Congress. And there was just recently a hearing that was held on one of the Privacy Act proposals. I think that there was a little bit of surprise that it didn't go well. I think that there is some consternation and perhaps concern within certain communities on how exactly we approach that. And really what they're doing is they're trying to create a balance between the need for data to be effective in building a model and the consumer need for privacy. So we'll see that debate play out, and very much not a solved problem quite yet. It also advocates for additional standards, and I think that is certainly something that is ongoing. NIST has largely been charged with going out and developing the standards. I know that they're working very hard. NIST has an AI working group that you can sign up for alerts on. And if you're interested in what's going on there, please contact me and I can tune you up to that and give you info on that. It also talks about transparency, explainability, testing, and evaluation. Certainly concerns, and these have been concerns again since the beginning of usage on AI. There's a lot to this, and it's very difficult. It's a little bit like saying, hey, can you be transparent with how your brain came to this conclusion? And sometimes, it can be a little difficult to explain. Well, similarly, transparency and explainability are very difficult in these large language models where you've got billions of parameters, billions of little numbers that are floating back and forth, and being able to go back and say, it was this piece of data that created that output in comparison to some other output. Very difficult, very, very difficult. Having said that, though, just because it's difficult doesn't mean that it's not real and not needed. So I anticipate that there will be additional breakthroughs, and consequently, there will be additional legislation that surrounds explainability and transparency. Next slide. The next slide is about the FAA. There you go. There's a market survey that was released on June 11, and you can see that the FAA is out looking at how do we ensure that we are utilizing AI in the most effective manner possible. They recognize that they're collecting a tremendous amount of data, and their request back to industry is, are we utilizing it effectively? How could we change what we're doing there? How do we make sure that we have the right data with the right quality at the right time, and it has the right availability, and yet it has the protections available both to individuals as well as companies? So a lot of thorny issues that they're trying to work through there. Next slide is our additional legislative activity. And a couple of things that are ongoing. Number one, Senator Klobuchar has a bill that has been entered. It's on the calendar to be discussed. It will be discussed. It's a fairly short piece of legislation. It talks about number one, a report that recommends how to use AI to assess interference in elections. And then number two, a follow-on report that says for the 2024 elections, how did we actually do against the standards that are proposed in that first report? I do think that it has a pretty good chance. I think that everyone would agree that the politicians don't want their name and likeness to be used improperly. And as a constituent, I don't want to be looking at information that falsely represents a given candidate. And so I think that there is a tremendous amount of interest across the board in moving that forward. There's also topics on privacy, liability, and intellectual property. These ones are going to be a little bit more complex. And the reason I say that is because when you think about intellectual property, these models need data, and some of that data may be controlled or it may be owned by someone else. And then you use that data to create a trained model. And in cases where you're using data that was generated from one place and then the model was generated somewhere else, trying to disambiguate where the value really lies, the percentages of values, who has the biggest claim, if you will, on the financial benefit from utilizing such a model, it's still to be determined. And having said that, though, again, just because it's difficult doesn't mean that it's not something that we need to be pursuing. I think we will be pursuing it. I think that it will be somewhat iterative, and it will be interesting to see. The other thing I would note is that if you're tracking legislation, you will see some market differences in the way that the US is approaching versus the EU. The EU Act, as I said, just went into law just the other day, and it has some pretty quick implementation timelines. I think that you'll see in February of next year, as I recall, that there begin to be requirements associated with executing AI models in the EU. Incidentally, Meta today or yesterday came out and said, listen, we've got this really great model, but we will not be participating in the EU because they feel like the liability there is too high. So there is going to be a dance back and forth on these models and whether, how they're regulated and whether businesses want to play. So last slide there. So what's happening? I think that you will see movement, not just on in the US, but I think that you'll see movement in legislation and in particular in regulation within states and municipalities. So California is being very active, New York, Colorado. There are a lot of different states that are actually now moving forward with privacy legislation. It will be a while before we really settle on this, and it's very much a new thing, and it's happening very quickly. And I think that that's kind of the concern. If you listen to Senator Warner as an example, I've heard him several times say we got the regulation around social media wrong, and we need to not do that with AI. Well, AI is moving so quickly; it's going to be very difficult to catch it, to contain it. And there's also questions around global competitiveness. So very complex issues that they're trying to address. Having said that, as I said, I think that AI usage in elections will move forward. I think that data privacy will be the next big hurdle. And I think that you will see agencies come out with policy rather than necessarily overarching legislation. When you look at AIA as a group, where are we going? We formed our AI working group and we are off to the races there already. There is a DoD request for comment. It's very similar, I think, to what the FAA requested. They've got 13 questions that they've asked for the industry's opinion on. It's due on Monday. We will be submitting on Monday, and we've got some really good content, I think, to put forward against their requests around workforce and training and data availability and small businesses and roadblocks and opportunities. All of that is addressed there. We also have a paper on AI governance that is in work. What our intent there is to put together the best practices around governance and to really get ahead of regulation and legislation in such a way that we instill confidence in our customer community for them to be able to recognize that we're very serious about the implications of utilizing AI. We know how to do it, and we're ahead of the curve. So I think we're now on to Q&A, and I would say, Ananda, if you can go to that last slide, you'll be able to see the links that I've got there that you can go. There you go. You can pull up the EO, the OMB guidance. There's a fact sheet on the EO that I think is a really good summary, and then the roadmap itself. So with that, Ananda, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions. I'm gonna leave it open for just a few more seconds here, just in case anyone does want to type any questions. Feel free to type them into the chat or into the Q&A section. But I'm not seeing any, so I guess we'll close it out here. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Tim. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to Tim or reach out to someone from the AIA team. Thank you, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks.